how many of you are part of the organization team for Obama? All the back, okay. Well, thank you, and thanks to Andrew and Wes especially for getting everything organized. So I was here once before during the primary, I think in the cafeteria, right? But I've never, is this for us or is there something else going on? I'm kind of thirsty. There's two of them if anyone else wants. I've never done anything remotely like this before in terms of campaigning or volunteering for anybody. I'm a registered independent. I've always, I've actually probably voted for as many Democrats as Republicans as third-party candidates, depending on the type of election it was. And the reason that I've been a registered independent is because I've tended to be really cynical about politics. I remember from the time we were kids, you always see stories, especially on CNN or MTV News, that talk about how if you're under 30 or under 25, you're probably never actually going to vote. That we have big enough numbers, but the likelihood is that we don't care enough, that we're not motivated enough. So I kind of bought into that, which is why I was independent, why I was so cynical. I'm still independent, but the whole volunteering thing changed for me about 4 years ago. And here's why. I was living down in Texas, right outside of Houston. Houston? So I was in Sugar Land, which is like 20 minutes outside, more of a suburb than a smaller town. But I was living there, and a friend of mine who was working at this trucking company was making minimum wage, trying to save up money for college. And he was the guy who at his trucking company would cut up empty boxes at the end of the night, put them in the recycling bin, he would do a bunch of paperwork, phone calls. And that was his job. He really wanted to go to school. And his phone rang one day. And the person on the other line said they were calling from a company called Halbert. You guys know Halbert? I love laughter. Sometimes you tell a story and Halbert gets booze because it's Dick Cheney's old company. But the laughter is cathartic. We're trying to keep it positive. Unfortunately, Halbert called my friend and said that they would offer him $90,000 for a year if he agreed to go to Iraq for them to drive a truck for their company, for the private sector. And so he called me up, and he called up a few of our other friends and said, what do you guys think I should do? Because that $90,000 compared to the minimum wage he was making would have paid for undergrad, it would have paid for probably part of grad school and part of a down payment on a small apartment, and he would basically be set. But the trade-off, certainly working for a private contractor in Iraq, was that he wasn't sure if he was going to come back. And we talked about it for a really long time, and the only thing that we could conclude was, no matter what he decided to do, this was a really sad thing that the world's richest, most powerful country could only offer our buddy who wanted to go to college two options, either minimum wage or $90,000 in the middle of a war zone. So this cynical side of me got even more cynical, and I thought, clearly this whole one vote could make a difference thing doesn't mean much, because we've gotten ourselves into such a dire situation that this is the decision my friend has to make. Thankfully, about 4 weeks after this phone call, I was watching television, this was back in 2004, and I was watching the Democratic National Convention very cynically, and thinking to myself, all these guys are never going to be able to change anything, neither are the Republicans, they all take federal lobbyist money, there's nothing anyone can do, special interests are too tied up in this. And this guy walks on stage, skinny guy with big ears, starts delivering the keynote address, and talks about this concept of how there shouldn't be blue states and red states, we should be focused on being a unified United States. And that kind of got me, because especially after 9/11, this concept that we were too divided was something that I felt was hurting us, and half my friends are conservative, the other half are pretty progressive. So to hear somebody who was actually making that statement at a party convention was very compelling. And by the end of his speech, I think a lot of us looked at Senator Obama and thought, wow, when is this guy going to run for president? Thankfully, a year and a half, 2 years ago when he decided to run, my friends and I remembered that speech and thought, all right, this guy's great with words, he delivers amazing speeches, let's see what the substance is. How did he start his career as a politician or as a public servant? So we looked at his record, and I was really impressed to learn three things in particular. First was how he started out as a community organizer. I know if you saw Governor Kennedy's speech, you don't understand this concept. So let me you know that there are scores of jobs, especially for our parents' generation, that are being shipped overseas. There are less jobs that we're going to inherit when we graduate college or grad school. So to know that Barack was a community organizer actually working with the people who were laid off because of Bush-McCain types of policies was a huge asset to those of us who were looking for a real fundamental change in the way that politicians did things. So that was pretty impressive. The second was that Barack went to Harvard Law School and was the head of the editor of the law review there, which is like being the number one in your class. And he turned down corporate law job offers, these hundreds of thousands of dollars they would have paid him every year. He turned that down to be a civil rights lawyer. If any of your poli-sci majors are thinking about law school, if you just want to Google it, civil rights lawyers really don't make very much money, which is why Barack and Michelle Obama only recently paid off their student loans, and it was only because of Barack's book deal. It's a true story. So he was a civil rights lawyer. Instead of taking these corporate law jobs, he rejected them, worked for real folks on the ground. And the third was that after all this, he became a constitutional law professor for 10 years. I don't know about you, but I think it would be amazing to have a president who actually read the Constitution and taught it for 10 years. My friends and I joke about that. But what that signified, or what that did signify to us, whether it was friends who were Republicans, Democrats, or independents like myself, it signified that we actually had somebody who was running for president who had a public service background instead of someone who came from an elite family or who had been in Washington, D.C. for decades. This was somebody who really understood what it was like for folks from the working class environment who were union members who were trying to get by day to day. So we started looking at his policies, and the biggest thing that stuck out in our minds was his education plan, particularly because it would have helped my friend in Texas. It's a $4,000 tax credit for every person who wants to go to college. So in exchange for community service, you get the first $4,000 of college paid for. And we've been meeting folks all over the country who have 5 or 6 brothers and sisters, and families have to decide which one, if any, get to go to college. That's not something that's acceptable to Barack, nor I think would be acceptable to any of us. So under this particular plan, if you're an only child or if you've got 10 or 12 brothers and sisters, the same $4,000 tax credit applies to you. At private universities, or places that are not community colleges or state schools, whereas the tuition rates are even higher, Barack also should know that he's also a big proponent of increasing the Pell Grant, which is something that Senator McCain is consistently opposed to doing. This is another policy that, if you're concerned about education and the cost of it. So he wants to increase the Pell Grant and also restructure the way that privatized student loans operate. For those of you who have privatized student loans, they charge exorbitant interest rates. So by the time you graduate college, you're deeply in debt, and it's going to take you decades to actually pay off that debt. That's not right. So these are all programs to make sure that folks have fairer and more equal access to education. So that was one of the pinnacle things, in addition to the Iraq War, universal health care, no federal lobbyist money, that made us sign up. So I filled out